A normal family slaughtered in their own home. No known enemies, no sign of forced entry, and no footsteps leading out of the property. This is the story of the Hinterkaifech Murders in Bavaria, and as a disclaimer, this does have scenes of a very violent nature. Welcome back to Just Another Mystery, the channel where we talk about true crime, we talk about cults, we talk about mysteries. This is the channel that if you want your fix on a weekly basis, then you should subscribe and help me reach my goal of my first 500 subscribers. That would be amazing. But before we get into this, make sure you have a drink and a snack. It does get very dark, but we're covering a lot of information here. So make sure you're comfy and let's jump in. So the Hinterkaifech farm was built in 1863 and it was built for the Hinterkaifech family. Now this was a small farm that had a couple of animals. It was very much a family farm, so it wasn't anything too extravagant, but you can imagine it was quite isolated and your nearest neighbor would be a couple of, it would be quite a while away. They were surrounded by forests and farms, fields kind of thing, so they didn't have loads of contact with the outside world. They were a very quiet and insular family who generally liked to keep to themselves. So there was a family of 5. We had Victoria, who was a widow. Her husband had died in World War I, unfortunately. And then we had her 2 parents, Andreas and Kazilia, I believe it's pronounced. So Andreas and Kazilia were Victoria's parents, and they owned the farm. Victoria lived on it, and Victoria also had 2 children. Now she had Kazilia, which was her 7-year-old girl, and Joseph, her 2-year-old son. Now Kazilia was the daughter of her husband who had passed away, but no one quite knew who the father of Joseph was, as he had been conceived after the husband had passed away. The family were relatively normal for the farming community, and whilst they got slightly involved, they very much kept to themselves. For example, Victoria would go and sing in the church choir, but she wouldn't be seen hanging out and doing anything crazy. They never had any wild stories about them, and instead were very steady members of the community. Now it's important to look back before the incident. About 6 months prior to the incident happening, there was a maid who actually quit from the Hinterkaifech farm because she thought it was haunted. See, she had been hearing footsteps throughout the attic, and there was constantly noises going on that had no explanation. So she reasonably deduced that it was haunted and actually left her job because she was so scared of it. Now within that 6 months, Andreas, remember the granddad, he also found a newspaper that he hadn't bought that was just left out on the side. And this newspaper, well, he hadn't bought it, no one else in the house had bought it, and he thought maybe the postman has just made a mistake and brought me this. But the postman knew nothing about it either. So it was this newspaper that seemed like it had just come out of nowhere, and he told his neighbors about it but it wasn't exactly a big deal, It was a newspaper. It's not like a crime had been committed. It was just strange, and with their previous maid thinking the house was haunted, maybe it was. Now this is where something very creepy happened. Andreas had noticed 2 sets of footprints in the snow leading towards the farmstead about a week before the incident. Whilst he had gone and told neighbours and said this is what has happened, he didn't think it was a big enough deal to report it to the police. Neighbours also offered to help him search the farm and have a look for whoever might have caused these footprints, but Andreas, being the man that he was, being someone who had owned the farmstead for such a long time and quite a proud man, He refused the offers of help and instead decided that he would go and search the whole farm for himself. Now, Andreas found nothing. And I think this is when you understand how creepy this case is, because those 2 footprints that had led into the farmstead, no footprints were found leaving the farmstead. This, combined with the previous happenings, was starting to spook everyone out a little bit. And the neighbors actually suggested that Andreas call the police, but apparently Andreas refused. He didn't see the point. And he was very steadfast in his ways. After 6 months of searching for a new maid finally showed up on the 31st of March 1922. Now, this maid had been dropped off by her sister. Her sister wanted to make sure that she was making it there safe and was ready for her first day at work. You know, she was a new maid in a farm that she hadn't worked at before. It was a very nerve-wracking day for this maid. So she came to the farm, she was safe, and then the sister left. On the 1st of April, 1922, 2 coffee merchants showed up to the Hinterkaifech farm and tried to get their usual order. These merchants had worked with the farm before, and they knew the family, but with no response to their door, and they couldn't see anyone around the farm, they ultimately decided to move on. Joseph, the postman, also noticed that a lot of the mail was starting to build up. He was arriving day after day, and none of the mail seemed to have been collected from where it was last left, so the pile was growing bigger. Joseph reported this to other people and said, have you seen them? They haven't collected their mail from where I leave it. So the neighbours started to get a little bit concerned. Combined with Victoria didn't show up at her choir practice, and little Kazilia hadn't shown up for school for 3 days. Now, with all of this going on, they had a neighbour called Lorenz. Now, Lorenz had heard all of this and started to get a little bit worried and said, hey, who's going to come with me? We need to go and investigate their farm and make sure that they're okay. So Lorenz managed to gather up 2 more people, Jacob and Michael. And on the 4th of April, 1922, they went to the Hinterkaifech farm. When they started looking around, they realized that the lock on the machine room door was broken, and they thought we should probably explore this. So they opened the machine room door, had a look through the room, moved a bit of hay and something that wasn't looking quite right on one of the boards. And unfortunately, they were shocked by the sight that they saw. Kazilia, the grandmother, Andreas, Victoria, and the youngest Kazilia were all deceased. All 4 had head wounds that had been made by a pickaxe and were hit repeatedly. The grandmother Kazilia was also found with marks around her neck, and the youngest Kazilia was found with a broken jaw and had been in so much agony she seems to have ripped out her hair. That detail of the youngest Kazilia having been in pain for so many hours that she ripped out her hair genuinely breaks my heart and shows you how monstrous a deed this was. I think it's important to remain respectful and also highlight the seriousness of this crime. But the Lorenz and the party needed to find the remaining 2. They went into the farmhouse, and under the sheets, laying in beds, were Joseph, the 2-year-old, with a head trauma by a pickaxe like the others, and the maid who had only worked for 1 day prior to the incident. She was also found with head injuries made by a pickaxe and had been covered in a thin sheet Now, with all of the horrifying elements of this, some strange things to note were that the house actually looked lived in. The animals were well fed, the fire had been on, the food had been made and eaten. So it was very strange, and it looked like someone had lived in the property for the days following the murders. Police initially arrived and thought maybe their first theory is that it's vagrants. Vagrants have come and they've tried to rob them and they've collected things. But there were a few things that didn't add up there. One, then why were the animals taken care of? Number two, there were large sums of money throughout the house, so why wouldn't they have taken that and just left? And three, they stayed in the house, so it wasn't just a robbery. As well as the injuries sustained seemed like they were personal attacks. There was some sort of personal vendetta there. The second theory was actually linked to Joseph, the 2-year-old. So Lorenz and Victoria had actually previously spoken about Joseph as if he was their son. Lorenz and Victoria were also destined to get married, except Andreas, Victoria's father, stepped in and denied this marriage. But following this, Lorenz had been married to someone else, and he had gone about his daily life. So this theory didn't really make sense, because why would he kill the entire family, including his own son? Without any concrete evidence on this theory, they had to let Lorenz go. And they also realized, he was also the one leading the search party. So it created a bit of disfavor within the community. Now, the third theory was where the police were really grasping at straws. Remember how Victoria had a husband who died in the First World War? Well, the police suggested that perhaps he never died. Perhaps he faked his death and had come back. However, this was very short-lived as a theory, because he was at war with a platoon who unfortunately saw him die. So this was also thrown out as a ridiculous theory that could not be the truth. Ultimately, there were no answers for this crime. And after 23 years, in 1955, this case became a cold case. The year following the murder, so in 1923, the house was actually burnt down by the community because they didn't want the memories of those people to be tainted and the memories in the neighborhood to remain of such an awful and tragic incident. In 2007, the police decided that they would try and open the case back up. But as the house was burned and the evidence was already very thin, as well as nearly 100 years old, there was not much they could do. And ultimately, the case is still cold. Now, I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are on this. Have you heard about this atrocity before? Make sure you comment down in the comments below, but please remain respectful, because ultimately these are real stories with real relatives and real victims. So whilst it's good for us to be aware, we also need to remain respectful. If you are always interested in true crime, mysteries, cults, etc., make sure you are hitting that subscribe button, and also maybe check out this video. It might be for you. If you hit the notification bell as well, you can get notified every Friday at 7 p.m. when a new video is released. That is every Friday at 7 p.m. Make sure you're there and watching, and otherwise we will see you in the next one.